Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Morning Grounds, Morning Rounds, Stony Brook Medicine's video series, where we engage in candid conversations with Stony Brook Medicine colleagues on key initiatives, institutional updates, and expert insights on critical topics. Stony Brook University, in an effort to focus on technology-based entrepreneurship and economic development, has appointed Michael Kinch as the inaugural Chief Innovation Officer for the university. Dr. Kinch has worked extensively in higher education, including in his most recent role as the Executive Dean of Sciences at Long Island University, where he created and deployed innovative approaches to improve biomedical translation and entrepreneurship. He founded and directed the Center for Research Innovation and Biotechnology, which analyzes the sources of biomedical innovation. Michael Kinch is here with me today to share more about his first year as CINO, his goals to blend research, scholarship, and discovery, and his vision of making Stony Brook University profound and positive impact on society for generations to come. With a PhD in immunology and a BS in molecular genetics, Dr. Kinch is committed to blending the university's expertise in science, research, and technology, and harness its incredible potential for innovative development. So, grab your coffee, settle in, and let's get started. Welcome, Dr. Kinch. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Share with us a little bit about your professional journey and what paved the way for you to be appointed as Stony Brook's first Chief Innovation Officer.
So I started out as a professor at Purdue University and was doing research in breast cancer and prostate cancer and other diseases and novel ways of treating them. And about a year after getting tenure, I turned to the dark side and accepted a role to start cancer research at a small biotech company named MedImmune. Mm-hmm. And MedImmune became a very large biotech company. And we were very successful in helping pioneer the world of what's now known as immune oncology, and did quite a bit of work in that, worked in a couple of startups, and then came back into academia to lead drug discovery at Yale University, just across the Sound. And at Yale, we were looking at how can we engage the academic world to be translational, to take the ideas in folks' head and turn them into real-world opportunities. And so that went quite well, and I was soon recruited to Washington University in St. Louis, or WashU, and was there for about 10 years, and we did the same. And as you mentioned, I came back to the East again, and first was I've been on Long Island for about 3 years, and at Stony Brook for about a year.
Mm-hmm. Great. I am curious, what do you see as sort of the differences between academic research and private corporation research? What are their sort of strengths? What could they learn from each other?
I think there's a lot. We could probably talk for hours about what they can learn from one another. And when people say, describe your job in one word, I say translator, because there is so much to translate back and forth. Industry tends to be very focused on a particular product. Their job is to basically create a product that has to go through this long, arduous approval process to gain regulatory approval before it can then be sold and marketed. And academia tends to be more, hey, I've got an idea, where might this go? And it tends to be a bit more open-ended. And so the mindsets are not exclusive, but there certainly are, big differences as far as what can be funded, who's going to fund it, how is it funded, how long can it last? And there are big differences, I would say, between those two worlds. And I would argue strong misperceptions and misconceptions of academia about industry and industry about academia. So I view it, my job is, again, to be the translator to help overcome a lot of those misperceptions.
Well, it's great that you can serve in that role for us, and I think it's wonderful. Can you share a little bit about maybe a moment that you had where it really convinced you of the significance of connecting research and commercialization?
It probably goes back to when I was at Purdue. And I had developed a novel way of targeting cancers with these things called monoclonal antibodies, which at the time no one had heard of monoclonal antibodies. And I was determined to publish the work and move on so that the world would know that this was an opportunity and people smarter than I would seize on it and move forward. And I had the head of the tech transfer office sit me down one day and said, look, you patent something in order to enable it, not in order to prevent others from being able to do it. But if you don't have a patent, he then continued, you can't commercialize it. And so if you want your ideas to reach the real world and hopefully new medicines to help treat diseases, then you're going to have to go through the patenting process. And at first I wasn't sure if I believed them or not, and went back and he was correct. And frankly, the rest of my world changed. And soon I found myself going from being a pure academic to, as I mentioned, going over to industry.
Well, that's a great story. Very different way of viewing things than I think a lot of people in an academic setting think about it.
Absolutely. And I come from a rather unconventional background. Many professors grew up in academic families. I grew up in the same hometown as our current vice president, in a family where my mother was the first person to ever go to college, and she became a third grade teacher. And so I've kind of view myself as a pragmatist. And at the end of the day, in, for example, academic medicine, our job is to take the ideas and get them into the real world where they can help people.
That's great. What are the core challenges that you think Stony Brook University can tackle under your leadership?
Well, I see an incredible amount of potential. And I think the key is being able to identify what are the most promising opportunities within the School of Medicine and beyond. We have, as a university, incredible strength in energy and information and in medicine. And those are sort of the big three, not only in terms of what we do well, but where there are huge societal needs. Mm-hmm. The key is not every faculty member is going to become a successful innovator or entrepreneur. And so how do you identify and then help facilitate and guide those would-be innovators and entrepreneurs to become preferably not just innovators and entrepreneurs once, but that they do it over and over and over again. And that's what you generally find at most universities is you have a small number of people that are serial inventors, serial entrepreneurs. And the key is unlocking that potential in faculty members that may not even realize that they've got it.
That's great. It just sort of, the next obvious question in my mind is we have medical students, graduate students, dental students, undergraduates, all these different students. Is this something that we can teach our students? And if so, what are the key elements of that curriculum?
I would argue that we not only can do it, we have to do it. And that was something that, frankly, I learned, especially at Washington University in St. Louis, where in my first days there, and frankly, in my first days at Stony Brook, I talked to a number of folks and said, what is holding back innovation and entrepreneurship? And what I heard back was, look, I do a lot of clinical service, I do research, I teach, I don't have time. And so what we ended up doing as an experiment there, and we're continuing here, was to say, let's engage the undergraduates, the graduate students, the postdocs, who they don't know what their career, where it's going yet, and help them to become entrepreneurs. So we're taking a team-based approach where a professor might have an idea, but we encourage them, and we're frankly now requiring them to advance the idea with a team. And that team can consist of primarily your students, your technicians, the folks that are around you that perhaps have more time, maybe even have a little bit of experience. And how do we then, as a team, move forward? And frankly, the rationale for that is also that it acts as a force multiplier. So instead of teaching one professor something who then maybe would talk to somebody else, if you engage their students and teach the students and the postdocs and the residents and fellows around them, you get a force multiplier, and they tend to talk to each other. And so you get a force multiplier that also tends to be infectious. So you'll get a lateral spread. So that's our open conspiracy is to create an infectious environment where this will catch on very quickly.
That's great. It's interesting because I think many people might think of innovation as being something that only a rarefied few are capable of. And really what you're describing is that it's a mindset, it's a way of thinking, and given the right set of tools, anyone or any group of people can really innovate.
Absolutely. And I think the key is identifying the problems. We all tend to go at, make a presumption that a whiz-bang technology is going to be the thing that's needed to be a new innovator. But when you actually look at most of the innovations, it wasn't the whiz-bang technology. It was the recognition that perhaps even a more mundane technology might address a particular problem. So what are the problems that are out there, and then how can we address them? And perhaps my favorite example of that is a company called Stony. And Stony basically identified that lower income individuals couldn't afford prescription glasses. Mm-hmm. And so the solution was they realized that glasses that cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars, most of that wasn't necessary. And they sell them starting at $6 or $7. And they've made a successful business, but more importantly, they've actually opened up prescription eyewear to many people who prior to that couldn't afford it. Mm-hmm. And so they identified the problem and they thought, here's a solution to do it. So whenever I talk with faculty members about what they're doing, I say, okay, so what are the problems that you experience? And in a medical setting, there are many different problems, from surgeons needing a particular device to, gosh, I wish someone could do medical billing better, or something in between. And so, okay, then let's come up with what the solution might be. And that's really the key.
Great. Thank you. You've written extensively about the importance of the country's research universities, specifically in pharmaceutical innovation. What do you feel is necessary to keep the U.S. maintaining its leadership in global drug development?
So it's a big question, and I'll kind of preface it by saying that we did an analysis about a year ago that shocked me, which is that we asked, where is there evidence where academic institutions had contributed to the key patents needed for medicines? And without going into all the gory detail, what we found was that in the late 1990s and early 2000s, academia had a minimal, if any, role. In the last 5 to 10 years, we're exceeding now half of all new medicines have an academic contribution. And not only is it an academic contribution, 93% of the time, I believe it's an American institution. So the key is that we have these engines of innovation that are pumping out these new medicines, and we need to facilitate how do we have more of that research? How do we help translate that research? How do we make it that it's the rule rather than the exception? And all of this is coming at a time when, frankly, as I think everyone's probably aware, the stresses on research and development budgets is higher than it's ever been. So it's a series of challenges, but the real problem is if we don't do this right, not just maintaining, but doing it better, we will lose our lead to other countries that are willing and interested in doing this. And that's crucial because when you talk about the effects of drug discovery, not only does it affect a lot of people's lives, we're talking trillions of dollars in the annual economy that come from this. So it's there are as many economic reasons from a pragmatic standpoint as there are medical reasons that we should be doubling down rather than cutting back on that research.
Well, let's hope everybody listens to that message. But let me ask you this. Why is it that having the United States have this kind of dominance in this space is so important? Why couldn't it be France or the UK or Germany or something?
It could be, and it's not, and the intention is not to promote nationalism. But I think the question that I would ask is, do you want the Chinese deciding which medicines that are going to be developed? And in the way that it has worked generally in the West, I would include Europe and US as all sort of having the same mindset is, where is there an opportunity we can address and what is the solution? And then coming up with the medicine. In other nations, it isn't necessarily being driven by that. It may be driven by economic decisions or political decisions that are well outside of what we would consider to be the norm. And so that's, to me, the biggest concern, other than the economics, is the question of what if, for example, medicines are targeting only diseases that are not relevant to the United States, or even excluding the United States intentionally to do so by someone that might be perceived as or in actuality an adversary. So I think there is a real risk if we abandon that academic research that we've come so heavily to rely upon.
Right. I want to turn to a little bit of discussion about your current role. So what are your top priorities as Chief Innovation Officer in the next couple of years?
I think what I've done in the past year is to really look around and say, what infrastructure do we have? And perhaps more important than that is, what are our unfair opportunities, our unfair advantages that Stony Brook University has? There are many universities out there that are doing translational research, be it in biomedicine, energy, and information. Where are those areas that Stony Brook uniquely has an unfair advantage, a head start on the rest of the competition? And where do those unfair advantages match to where there are societal needs? And so that's really where you're going to get your biggest successes. And so at Stony Brook, we have a number of strengths and unfair advantages that could be advanced even further, as well as others that are emerging. And so how do we then take a limited number of resources that we have and deploy them most efficiently?
Makes sense. Do you anticipate any obstacles in the university environment as you try to roll out some of your aims and you try to accelerate translation of research? And if so, how do you manage that?
I think the biggest obstacle that I expect to encounter, and it hasn't been terrible so far, but it's out there, is this is something new. And again, you have faculty, staff, students saying, I'm already saturated. I'm already working really hard. How do I do this plus everything else that I've done? And that's where we're going to have to get creative. And that's where the work that you do with the faculty and with the entire community has to be individualized. For this project, they need these resources or this help. How do we match them up? Something that I'm not a believer in is that, I come in with a solution or a plan that will solve all problems. I mean, each problem is its own set of, and especially in the medical world, its own set of unique challenges. You've got regulatory challenges and humanity challenges and ethical challenges and a number of other things. How do we make sure that the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't actually ruin something that might otherwise have been successful? So we're trying to give individualized treatment. That unfortunately means you can't scale it up as much as you would perhaps like, but that also means you've got a great opportunity to look objectively and say, okay, where do we think those great opportunities are going to come from?
The flip side of that is, what are the assets that we have at Stony Brook that can really be useful in leveraging discovery and translating it to innovation and commercialization?
We have many. When you look at imaging, as you're well aware, we've been a pioneer as an institution in this, and there's a lot of legacy. We still have a lot of interest and intellectual capital in addition to intellectual property that can be deployed. Likewise, we have a very and particularly strong engineering school. I was at Purdue, which has strong engineering, and other schools, and engineers approach things from a much more real-world pragmatic standpoint. So how do we engage that expertise, combine it with what's going on in the medical school to be able to create true synergies? So it's not 1 + 1 = 2, it's equals 7. And so we're trying to identify where can we find and facilitate a lot of those engagements.
That's great. You've discussed innovative commercial development in Long Island. What about the region? Where are the strengths in the region that you've identified that, again, can sort of help us even outside the walls of our university?
There are incredible opportunities and, frankly, challenges. Sometimes they're one and the same. And what I have noticed based on my own research is that, for example, we have one of the highest, if not the highest, concentration of generic pharmaceutical manufacturers in the United States here on Long Island. And most people have that exact response. They're like, seriously? And here's the challenge and the opportunity, which is that most generic medicines in general are imported. And they tend to be, I think it's 85% or so from India and or China. Well, what if there's a world tension or something that basically or another pandemic that cuts back or cuts out our access to a lot of these medicines? There's an opportunity here to potentially say, okay, we might be able to help address that. Let's deploy our innovative and entrepreneurial side to come up with some novel ways of doing so. From a more technical standpoint, there are other technologies that exist in other areas, other fields. For example, information technology that we have, and AI and quantum and technologies that we have at the university that have potential implications outside of just the field that they're in. Mm-hmm. And how do we engage the experts, for example, in some of the quantum work that we're doing, sit them down with some of the medical-based folks and say, might we be able to solve problems that perhaps before a meeting we couldn't have imagined, and after the meeting we've got a plan to start tackling them. So that's really part of what we want to do. And what it comes down to is not me being smart or me making any decisions or calling any shots. It's getting other people in a room, getting them to interact, and again, trying to identify where 1 + 1 = 7.
Right. And to me, that's one of the most exciting things about being in a university, right, is that kind of interaction and, an intellectual augmentation.
My favorite words are, gosh, I never thought of that before.
Yeah.
And when you get different folks to do so, then you've unopened something that oftentimes leads to something quite valuable and lasting and durable.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And I do want to mention that certainly any clinician who's been in practice for the last 5 years can identify the number of times where we've had, drug stockouts, shortages, and related to things that we need every day for our patients because we don't have enough local capacity to be able to make those products.
Absolutely. And another part of, I think, the larger conversation is there are medicines, but then there are medical devices, and not just that are used by MDs, but those that are used by physical therapists and occupational therapists. And it's, again, getting the whole community, because there may even be certain solutions that an occupational therapist solves a problem with this particular rationale or strategy that the physician may not be aware of. And so it's engaging them with one another and saying, oh, gosh, maybe there is an expansion or an opportunity to do this. And again, I don't come necessarily armed with all of this incredible knowledge to claim that I have the answers, but I do know that the people in the room will have some answers. And that's the key.
That's great. We talked a little bit about students, just to circle back on sort of how do we create that. But a lot of the people who are here are clinicians, and they do some research in a small amount. They'd spend some time teaching. You alluded to that earlier in your conversation by talking about some of the barriers. How do you bring that large group of people who aren't necessarily able to commit 80% of their time to a research project into the area of innovation?
I think the key is to identify, again, where are those opportunities and what needs to get done. And I always tell people that what we're looking to do is to get from point A to point B in a straight line, or as straight of a line as possible. And what you find a lot of times is that the line goes all over the place from A to B. And so how do we, emphasizing efficiency, how do we get from that point A to point B? And part of it is also, when you decide I'm going to go from point A to point B, you have to be able to measure progress as you go along. And if you're frankly not getting any closer and you're moving over here and getting further away, then there are times when you just have to stay or say, we're not going to continue this. It's what's known as the kill early and often approach. Mm-hmm. And so what that really means, because some faculty and other folks might be upset by that, but because that project didn't work doesn't mean the next one won't. Right. So you want to deploy the limited resources you have towards those activities that you think are going to actually, move the ball the furthest length down the field, so that you're gaining that true value for the university as a whole.
That's great. I think President Goldsmith refers to that as fail fast.
Exactly. Yes.
So that you can go on to the next project.
Kill early and often is maybe a little more brutal. Yes.
Understand. Well, that wraps up today's episode. Dr. Kinch, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your leadership in advancing Stony Brook University as a leading research institute and hub for innovation. And to all members of the Stony Brook Medicine community, thank you for your continued dedication to discovery, education, and the highest quality patient care. Until next time, keep the coffee brewing and innovation flowing at Stony Brook Medicine.